The two biblical accounts of creation and the flood. The Torah, containing the first 5 books of the Old Testament, is a document of immense importance for the understanding of the coming into consciousness of humanity, as it contains writing spread out over more than 1,000 years, from before 1200 BC to the 2nd century BC. In this lecture we'll zoom in on 2 of its most famous stories, the creation of the world and Noah's flood. And as we shall discover, both stories are actually told twice in the Bible, one by the so-called J source and one by the P source. And in both versions, these stories are told differently with irreconcilable differences. For instance, the order of creation is different, and also the duration of the flood in Noah's story, and also the number of animals taken on the ark. But there's also a more important difference. Based on these versions, we see God transform from a tribal God who walked among men and spoke to men face to face, to a more distant and abstract God who spoke authoritatively from heaven. So, we have a lot to talk about. Let's start. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. We'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface-level understanding you get on other channels. Go check it out for yourself. Let's start. Genesis, the first book of the Bible, means origins, as the first 2 chapters describe the creation of the world and the first human beings. Strangely, however, these 2 chapters contain 2 conflicting accounts of creation. The first one, Genesis 1, is given by the so-called priestly source, or P, and the second one, Genesis 2, by the Elohist source, E. Even the order in these creation stories is different. For instance, in the first version, plants get created, then animals, and then men and women simultaneously, while in the second version a man gets created, named Adam here, then the animals, and then a woman named Eve. The first account, Genesis 1, written by the P source, was actually written later than Genesis 2, around the 6th century BC, it is estimated. It speaks of a universal, omnipotent, and transcendent God named El, or Elohim, who uses his words to create order from chaos. It famously starts as follows. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Beautiful lines. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. And then God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky. And there was evening and there was morning, the second day. On the third day, God created dry land and vegetation. On the fourth day, he created the sun, the moon, and the stars. Interestingly, he first creates day and night and then the sun, which is a bit strange, but we continue. On the 5th day, he created the fish, the birds, and then land animals. And on the 6th day, he created mankind. We read, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness.' So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. And then God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it.' God then saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. And thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. And by the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work." Notice how this account of creation is very formal and methodical. it describes a cosmic God of a great ordered universe. Now let's move to the second account, Genesis 2. It was written earlier by the J source, likely in the 9th or the 8th centuries BC, and it consistently uses Yahweh instead of Elohim as the name for God. In this account, we find ourselves in a particular place, the Garden of Eden, meaning the Garden of Pleasure. Instead of an abstract and transcendent God who spoke from the heavens, we're now told of an anthropomorphic God, that is, a God who resembles man. We even read that he, quote, walked in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day. In this version, God is much more personal, and at times he is even reminiscent of the spirits from tribal mythology. He can just walk among men, and Jacob, later in Genesis, even fights with this God. In this version of the story, the purpose of creation is not to methodically create order from chaos, but simply to create workers to till the ground of the garden. To till it and to keep it, we read. And this is a clear Mesopotamian theme. And God then fashioned a man from the mud, also a Mesopotamian theme. We read, Then the Lord God, that is Yahweh, formed man from the dust from the ground, and breatheth into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being. Notice here the similarities between Ha-Adam, or man, and Adamah, or the soil or the ground, accentuating the relationship between Adam and the soil. He was made from the mud. Time and again, we find that God in the J-source is more emotionally involved with humanity. In this case, we read that God felt compassion for his creation, stating, quote, It is not good for man to be alone. To solve this problem, God created the animals and allowed Adam to name them, but Adam found no partner fit for him. God then created a woman from his side or rib. Afterward, God warned them not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Quote, From when you eat from it, you will certainly die. But not long after, the woman was tempted by a snake to eat from the tree. At first she resisted, but then the snake responded that God had not been telling the truth. We read, You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like the gods, knowing good and evil. This convinced the woman to take a bite, and then, quote, She also gave some to her husband, and he ate. And as a result of eating the fruit, the couple began to feel shame, experiencing a loss of innocence. And as a result, they noticed that they were naked, and then they clothed themselves in fig leaves. Then they heard the sound of God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of God among the trees of the garden. But God called to the man and said, Where are you? He said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. God then said, Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? And then the man said, The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit. She gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate. Then God said to the woman, What is this that you have done? And the woman said, The serpent tricked me, and I ate. And then God cursed all three of them. The woman would experience pain in childbearing, and the man would have to work infertile soil. And then God adds, By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground. From out of it you were taken, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Fearing that they might also eat from another tree, the tree of life, God then commanded them to leave Eden. And the Lord God said, The man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat, and live forever. So the Lord banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. And after he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. I hope you agree these are stunning differences between Genesis 1 and 2. Finally, let's jump ahead in time to the story of Noah and the flood. This story is also told twice, with similar differences. In this case, both sources were cut up and interlaced, forming somewhat of a coherent story, although with various duplets and contradictions. If the sources are read apart, however, we get two complete versions of the story, each with its own typical vocabulary, typical of J and P, and also with its typical theological emphasis. And again, one source consistently calls God Yahweh, and the other calls him Elohim. Now let's take a moment to see what this looks like. On Wikipedia we can find a version of Genesis that presents the different sources in different colors. Let's have a look. Here we see that the priestly source is highlighted in yellow, and the yahwist source is highlighted in blue. Chapter 1, as you can see, is written all yellow. So this is the priestly source, and this chapter tells the story of creation. Here, a few sentences into chapter 2, we skip to the yahwist or J source, and this is the second account of creation. Now we move to chapter 6, where we find the story of Noah. And as you can see, this is a mixture between the priestly and the yahwist source. The story is cut up to form one coherent story. Now, let's begin the story. At the start, we read that humanity had become evil. They had become so bad that God saw no other option but to destroy his creation with a great flood. Again, the J source takes the emotional route, stating, Yahweh saw how great was the evil of man on the earth. He regretted that he had made man on earth, and his heart, we read, was deeply troubled. A very emotional God. And he then concluded, I shall wipe out man, again Adam, from the face of the soil, again Adamah. P, in contrast, doesn't express regret, but again takes the more objective cosmic route. He simply observes the state of the earth and concludes that creation has to be reversed, almost as a matter of sheer cause and effect. We read, Now the earth was ruined before God, for the earth was filled with violence. The end of all flesh had come before me. I shall soon ruin them on the earth. Before sending the flood, however, God spoke to Noah, a righteous man, blameless in his generation. In J, we read that Noah was instructed by God to bring his family on board, and also 7 pairs of all clean animals and 1 pair of all unclean animals. J required these extra clean animals, as Noah would later sacrifice these animals to God right after leaving the ark. In P, in contrast, we read that Noah took only 2 of every animal onto the ark, as Noah doesn't perform a sacrifice in P's version of the story. As we've discussed in a previous lecture, P rewrote history so that only descendants of Aaron, the so-called Aaronite priesthood, could perform legal sacrifices. So they had to remove Noah's sacrifice from the story, and therefore also didn't require 7 pairs of the clean animals. The story of Noah, by the way, was inspired by the flood myth from the Gilgamesh epic from Mesopotamia, which is dated to the 18th century BC, some 1,000 years earlier. Here too, God floods the earth and only saves 1 family with an ark, but there are also some crucial differences in this version of the story. The Mesopotamian gods wanted to wipe out humanity because humans made too much noise, while the Jewish God, however, is more concerned with the moral behavior of mankind, as we've seen. God could no longer accept the evil in the world and therefore decided to eliminate it. So here the story got a more sensible plot. Then in Genesis 6 it starts to rain. In P, the flood was described as a cosmic catastrophe. We read that, quote, the fountains of the deep were broken up and the windows of the heavens were opened. Beautiful. In J, in contrast, it simply rains. But in this version, God does personally close Noah's ark, in line with his more personal nature. In J, the flood then lasts 370 days, while in P it takes 40 days and 40 nights. Eventually, Noah sent out a bird to see if the water had retreated. A dove is sent out in J and a raven in P. After a while, the bird returns with an olive leaf, suggesting that it had found land. The Gilgamesh version is similar in this case. Here Noah sends out birds until one doesn't return. When the ark stranded on a mountaintop, Noah sacrificed animals to God. In the Mesopotamian epic, the gods, quote, gathered like flies over the sacrifice, as they needed the sacrifice to survive. This made the god Enlil regret his decision to wipe out mankind. In J, but not in P, we see something similar. God here too, quote, smelled the pleasing aroma of the sacrifice, leading him to regret what he had done. And here he also shows mercy for humanity despite its flaws. We read, the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma of the sacrifice and said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures. Then, in P alone, we read that God established a covenant with mankind, promising never to wipe out humanity again, and God then created the rainbow as the sign of this covenant. And thus, the biblical stories of creation and the flood were formed. I hope you were inspired by this lecture, and if you want to know more about Jewish history or any other topic from world history, read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it completely for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. See you next time. Bye bye.